Do you ever get lonely? A question I periodically get asked as a solo traveler, and a question I often ask myself. Do I ever get lonely? I suppose it depends on how you choose to define it. If you merely mean, does being alone bother you? My answer will have to be no, about 95% of the time. I've been around people that have made me feel more alone than I've ever felt actually ever being alone. So it's not bothersome for me to be by myself for long periods of time. That doesn't mean I don't feel lonely. What I feel is the absence of a presence of something in a moment, I suppose. I have felt this absence more strongly these past few months than I have my entire time on the road. Loneliness. Not easily explained, as it is a complex emotion. So rather than drone on trying to explain myself, I thought it would be easier to tell you a story. A story of my most recent past. Now, warning, this video is long and kind of weird, so if that's not your thing, please make a safe exit towards the red box in the upper corners of your screen. And for those of you staying, now is the time to go to the bathroom, grab a snack, a blanket, and get nice and comfy. Alright, here's my story. After returning to the place I called home, following my first stretch of travels out west, I felt alive, excited, and ready to conquer anything life threw in my direction. So, I returned to the riverbanks of my old life. The river was full and strong. The water was cold and deep. And I decided it would be alright if I jumped into the river of my past life for a short time, since I was home. After all, I felt like I could conquer anything with my newfound self-assurance I'd gained from my travels. With that assurance, I took my first step into the water. My feet were covered with the frigid, ever-moving water, the cold creating a dull ache as I stood there, and a hint of doubt began to form in the dark corner of my mind. With just my feet in, I still felt fine, and I pushed away the doubt, convincing myself I could simply step out whenever I needed. That was until a voice from the river shouted in my direction, startling me. "Angie, nice of you to return," the voice said sarcastically. "Now that you got that childish notion out of your system, would you care to join everyone else?" That's when I noticed there were tons of people in the water, barely visible as I could only see their heads bobbing on the surface, being taken by the current. They were all facing forward, away from me, motionless and silent. I recognized the voice of the river. The familiarity of the voice filled me with belief in what it was saying was true. I turned back to the banks where I once stood. It was still close. After a quick debate in my head, I convinced myself I could return to the riverbank whenever I needed. And the river was right. I did want to join everyone else. So I slowly took another step into the river towards the voice. But I would be lying if I said I didn't feel a knot form in my stomach in that moment. The water stung my skin as the icy waves slapped my legs with such force it felt like it was going to knock me over. I gritted my teeth, the sting causing tears to form in the corners of my eyes as I felt the strength of my travels leave my body as my new reality set in. I couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. It had only been a short time I had been home. That's when I looked up and I noticed my parents passing me in a canoe. They slowed in the water and came up close to me. "What are you doing, Angie? You shouldn't be this far in the river. You were doing so well on land," my father exclaimed, concern coating his voice and plain on his face. I tried to blink back the pained tears and told him, "It's all right. I'm just gonna test the waters for a little while. I'm not staying in the river for long." A question more than a statement. A few tears were released from their prison, losing themselves to the water below. My mother gave me a knowing look. "Angie, you know you don't belong in the river. But if you ever need a lift, we are a simple call away and we'll come immediately. Do you understand?" I nodded, more tears escaping my eyes, disappearing into the river after their fall. My father's discomfort was painted across all the lines on his face. I could see he wanted to pick me up and place me in the boat with them. My mother, knowing this, placed a hand on his arm and looked at me again with a pained expression. But she nodded, and they slowly paddled away. I could see them constantly looking over their shoulders, checking on me. And when they were out of sight, I knew they had not gone far. The warmth I had felt from the interaction was quickly erased as the glacial waters of the river returned to the forefront of my mind. The voice deep inside the river returned again. "What a coward you are, slowly walking in. Everyone else is in here, the deep, with me. You're acting like a child, standing in the shallows with only half your legs in." The ice in its voice wrapped around my mind, sending goosebumps crawling across my entire body. I shivered, then turned back to shore. It looked a lot farther away than before, but still not completely out of reach. So I turned back to the center of the river. The words of the river burned into my brain, making me feel ashamed of myself. I took another step into the hostile waters, a numbness beginning to work its way into my toes. As I was taking another step in, I heard a splash next to me. "Hi, Ange. I didn't think I would see you in here." It was one of my closest friends, a sort of creature that can live both on land and in the water. I sighed, relieved to see them standing next to me. "Yeah, I figured while I was home I should probably come back to the river." I looked down, then quickly added, "Until I'm ready to get out again." I didn't look up to meet their eyes, but I could feel their gaze pierce right through me. "Okay, but I'm gonna check in on you every week, and I hope you'll tell me what's really going on." They forced me to make eye contact, then continued, "If you need anything, you tell me." I nodded, tears quickly returning, but I wiped them away in frustration. I could feel the warmth of an embrace that relieved my growing numbness for just a moment. Then they were gone. They easily leapt out of the river, and I saw that they had walked ahead, jumping in and out of the river with terrifying, confident precision. I couldn't help but look on with astonishment and a hint of envy. I sighed and took another step in. But this time, I lost my footing on a loose rock, and the current swept me away with a force so strong and quick I didn't have a chance to recover. The voice of the river laughed coldly. "Finally, took you long enough. You'll never escape me now. No one will find you out here. This is where you belong." I tried to feel for the bottom, but only felt water beneath me. And after the words of the river finally sunk in, I stopped fighting. The river was right. No one would see me out here. Maybe this is where I did belong. I looked around me, and I saw the blank faces of people also being swept away by the current. No one was fighting it. I resolved myself and began floating downstream, numbness working its way across my entire body. That's when I felt a sharp whack against the back of my skull. I turned around, incredulously looking for the source of such a hard hit. The source? A grumpy old man. I'm just kidding. He was only one of those things. "Howdy," he said, a playful smile stretching the width of his face. "Do I know you?" I replied, ignoring his greeting and annoyance heavily infiltrating my tone. I rubbed the back of my head, knowing that hit was gonna leave a mark. He shook his head, easily ignoring my irritated face. "No, I guess not, but I know you." The knowing grin hadn't left his face, and my irritation was quickly replaced by curiosity. "Oh?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Well, you see, I was once young and stupid like you two," he started, but I burst out laughing for the first time since I had gotten into the river. A real laugh. I liked this guy. He was old and grumpy, and I was young and stupid. What a pair we were. He swam down the river next to me for a while, telling me his story, and he was right. We were exactly the same. It was like talking to a future version of yourself that had done all the right things in life, while also hilariously teasing you in the process. I, of course, teased back, and I started feeling a growing fondness for the bump forming on the back of my head. I felt warmth return to the tips of my fingers and toes after our many conversations. But I was still in the river, and the current was strong. I knew I needed to get out, now. I began frantically looking for a way out, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the river was too strong for me to make an escape alone. I began to panic. My feet couldn't touch the bottom. I couldn't move my arms or legs to fight the current. My head was barely afloat. I wasn't going to survive much longer, as I felt the icy needles of the water sting every inch of my skin. That's when I looked up to the riverbank, and I saw a man clinging onto a rock jutting out from the water. He was barely holding on with both hands as the river pulled incessantly at his body, but at the same moment he looked up and saw me. Our eyes locked. I didn't know this man, but he had the warmest, kindest eyes I have ever seen, and I couldn't look away. The strange thing was, he wasn't looking away either. I felt the warmth from his eyes radiate into my limbs, almost like a spark that quickly ignited, setting flames running down my arms and legs, and I could finally move them again. "Hey!" I shouted, not daring to break eye contact. "Any room left on that rock?" He replied in a heartbeat, his voice soft yet confident. "There's room on the rock, but I'll do you one better. Let's get you out of the river." He smiled, a closed-lipped, toothless smile. Without looking away, I swam toward him against the current, spending every last ounce of strength I had left. I was closer now, so I reached out my hand in a last burst of strength. His face contorted into an innocent yet mischievous grin, which instantly brought a smile to my own exhausted face. He reached out his hand in the same instant. Our hands and our eyes were locked. Together, we pushed and pulled each other toward the riverbank through the current that kept trying to suck us back in. But before I knew it, we were on the banks, panting, dripping, and grinning like fools. The river angrily called out to me, but I couldn't make out any of the words over the kindness emitting from the pair of eyes that had entranced me. I couldn't look away. You might be thinking to yourself at this point in the story, it's a really strange thing to do, Angie, trusting a complete stranger like that. But the thing is, I think there's a deep knowing you can have about a person after only a handful of interactions. When it comes down to it, your real character, the core of who you are, is emitted from your very being and even the slightest actions you make. It's difficult to hide who you really are at your center. And everything this man did emitted pure, selfless kindness. And as we began talking, I was right. He was selfless and kind. But he was so much more than that. And I realized we were not strangers in the slightest. He told me the tale of how he ended up on that rock in the middle of the river. It was the same force that had sucked me in. He dreamed of aimlessly wandering along the river banks and through the surrounding hills, but could never find a way to make it out of the river without getting swept away by the force of the current. I nodded. I understood exactly what he meant, more than words could express. We stood there together for a while on the banks, talking about anything and everything, taking long walks to nowhere in particular, laughing, singing, dancing, and the interactions felt like the comforting warmth of a fire after a long, dark swim in the river. The chill had left my body completely, and I could feel parts of myself thaw and return that had been numbed by the icy water. I could have stayed on the riverbanks with those eyes forever. But alas, life is never that simple. He told me after a short time that it was time for him to return to that rock in the river. I opened my mouth to convince him otherwise, to stay. But I reluctantly nodded. He was on his own path, and I was on mine. At least that's what I told myself. So I stood there, holding back tears once again. He started toward the river, but stopped. He turned back one final time, gave me that devilish, tight-lipped grin. I couldn't help but instantly smile back at the sight of him, a tear escaping my unblinking eyes. And then he was out of sight. It started to rain. I was alone again, standing on the riverbank where our story began. But this time, I was a lot further downstream. And now there was a very present hollow in my chest that was not there in the beginning. What is loneliness? For me, it's sometimes the absence of an honest conversation with my parents. Sometimes it's the absence of a familiar, constant, loving presence of a friend. Sometimes it's the absence of a grumpy old man sharing priceless wisdom and laughter. Sometimes it's the absence of the warmth of kind eyes and long, aimless walks on the riverbanks with the man who pulled me to shore. I feel full of love at the thought of each of these, but simultaneously, the pain of their absence. In a word, lonely. As I find my footing away from the riverbank alone, I know deep down that I am the only one who could find my footing along my path. That doesn't mean I have to do it alone or without help. The path that lies before me is filled with intersections, surprise visitors, and helping hands. Some I have already met, and many I have not yet. I can't go back to the river, so my only path is forward. But while I do feel lonely, I also feel hope. My life is intersected with the most incredible humans I know who are never completely out of reach. We are all on our separate paths, but our paths are also delightfully interwoven at times. This story is dedicated to the ones who saw me slowly getting swept away and didn't allow it to happen. Each one of you gently, and sometimes forcefully, nudged me in the right direction, and I feel a gratitude I can't imagine I can ever repay. I feel undeserving of it at times, but I was given a second chance that I don't plan on wasting this time. So while loneliness can feel unbearably painful, I also feel a warmth and a love through it. I have known the many faces of love, and I can now feel its temporary absence as I stand alone on the riverbank. A blessing I don't take lightly. In these moments of pain, I can feel my mother's hug, hear my father's laugh, imagine my friend's listening ear, feel the bump on the back of my head from an old grumpy man checking to see if I'm still young and stupid, the feel of an embrace on the riverbanks with strong hands holding me, looking up to the heavens littered with countless stars, and the gaze of warm, kind eyes. Dedicated to the people we cross paths with that make us feel lonely, but never alone. With endless admiration, Angie. I take my first hesitant step forward. I look around. No one is there. I am alone. I grin, and I start down the new path, not knowing exactly where my feet will take me.